You know what's absolutely wild? Some of the most ridiculous movies ever made, the ones that got completely trashed by critics and seemed like total disasters, actually ended up saving entire film studios from going bankrupt. Let's start with one of the most famous examples of a dumb movie saving a studio. Transformers from 2007. And let's be clear about this. People absolutely despised this movie, with one of the most respected film critics at the time famously giving the first film just 2 stars. He said watching it was like being assaulted by screeching metallic mayhem. Ouch. And there are countless professional film reviewers, including video essayists on YouTube, that have spent hours describing how the franchise represents the death of intelligent blockbuster filmmaking. I mean, the movie is so universally despised that it spawned its own subgenre of hate watching, where people actively seek out the sequels specifically to mock them. Did you know that there are some film schools that actually use Transformers as a case study in how not to make movies? Teaching students about the importance of coherent editing and meaningful character development, and using this movie as the perfect example of what happens when you ignore those principles. But despite all that hate, no one talks about how Transformers completely rescued Paramount Pictures from the brink of devastating financial ruin. So, before Transformers, Paramount was struggling with a series of very expensive back-to-back flops. And financial bankruptcy was on the horizon. So the idea of making a movie based on children's toy robots seemed like an absolutely ridiculous solution. And some of the executives and industry insiders were convinced that director Michael Bay's background in cringy TV commercials and a script with almost no character development would further damage Paramount's already shaky reputation. I mean, the plot was simple to the point of being almost non-existent. The dialogue was bad, and the action sequences were so chaotic that many test audiences complained they couldn't even follow what was happening on screen. And as you would expect, when Transformers was released, critics absolutely savaged it. They called it loud, dumb, and visually incoherent. But here's what nobody expected. Audiences loved it. Transformers made well over $700 million worldwide, becoming one of the highest-grossing films of 2007. More importantly, for Paramount, it launched a franchise that would eventually earn over $4 billion across 5 films. And that's before we talk about all the income from the toys, merchandise, product placements, and other cross-promotional advertising. Michael Bay became one of the most successful directors in Hollywood, even though critics were, and still are, constantly bashing both him and his work. He's literally in the top 5 most financially successful directors in history, right behind Spielberg and James Cameron. The success of Transformers didn't just save Paramount from its financial troubles, it turned the studio into a major player in the blockbuster game. And the film's success gave Paramount the financial stability to take risks on other projects. They used profits from Transformers to fund other successful franchises like Mission Impossible and Star Trek, effectively upgrading the studio from a struggling operation into a blockbuster powerhouse, all thanks to what some might call a dumb movie about super big toy robots fighting each other. Now, let's talk about one of Hollywood's greatest misconceptions. The Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie from 1990 has one of the most misunderstood reputations in history. So here's the thing, most people assume the movie was a disaster. But the truth is, almost the complete opposite. It wasn't actually the flop everyone remembers it to be. In fact, that ridiculous movie literally saved New Line Cinema from what was a serious financial catastrophe. At the time, New Line was still a relatively small studio, and they were taking a huge gamble on this movie. But here's the problem. The concept seemed absolutely ridiculous, especially since this wasn't going to be a somewhat safe animated film, but a gritty live-action movie. And it wasn't even going to include any big-name A-list stars. So yeah, to many at the time, this had disaster written all over it. It sounded like something that might work as a straight-to-VHS cartoon, but as a live-action feature blockbuster film, it seemed destined for failure. New Line had acquired the rights to the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles property for a relatively cheap amount, but they were still taking a significant risk for a studio of their size. The film had to be made on a tight budget using practical effects and animatronics rather than expensive computer-generated special effects. When it was released, critics were literally falling over themselves to point out how rubbish it was. They called it silly and juvenile, with many questioning how well it would succeed when the martial arts action sequences were too cartoonish for adult audiences, but potentially too violent for young children. But New Line had correctly identified that there was a massive built-in audience for the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles property. Kids who had grown up with the cartoon and comic books were now older teenagers and young adults, and would enjoy seeing their favorite characters brought to life on the big screen. And you know what? Their bet paid off. The Teenage Mutant Turtles made over $200 million worldwide on a budget of just $13.5 million. And this doesn't even include the profit from all the toys, merchandise, and cross-promotion brand deals. This incredible return on investment gave New Line the financial resources they needed to expand their operations and fund bigger projects. Projects like The Lord of the Rings that came a few years later. The film's success was crucial in establishing New Line as a major player in Hollywood, rather than just a small independent distributor. Now, what if I told you that one of the most successful franchises in history started as a project that studio executives actively tried to kill? And this movie looked like such a guaranteed failure that Universal almost pulled the plug during production. I'm talking about The Fast and the Furious from 2001. At the time, Universal Pictures was dealing with several expensive failures like The 13th Warrior and Pearl Harbor. So they were desperate for a reliable hit to save them from financial ruin. The problem? The concept of The Fast and the Furious seemed almost guaranteed to fail. A movie about street racing with a plot borrowed heavily from Point Break, starring relatively unknown actors like Vin Diesel and Paul Walker. The dialogue was cheesy, the premise was simple, and the action sequences, while exciting, weren't exactly sophisticated for its time. But Universal made a smart move by making the film on the cheap for about $38 million. I mean, I know that doesn't sound cheap, but I'm talking about cheap when you compare it to some of their other blockbusters like Pearl Harbor, which cost well over $140 million to make. And of course, the critics were not impressed with the final product. They called the film predictable and derivative, with many pointing out how closely it followed the template of other action movies. The performances were criticized as cheesy, and the plot was dismissed as nothing more than an excuse to show off fast cars and young, attractive people. But none of that critical negativity mattered once audiences got to see the movie for themselves. The Fast and the Furious made over $200 million worldwide on that $38 million budget I mentioned earlier, turning Universal's gamble into an unexpected goldmine. The success of The Fast and the Furious launched one of the most profitable franchises in cinema history. The series has now made over $6 billion worldwide across 10 films, making it one of Universal's most valuable properties. More importantly, the movie tapped into something that audiences clearly wanted, even if critics couldn't understand the appeal. Home Alone from 1990 is another classic example of a small and seemingly simple movie that ended up carrying a whole studio on its back. 20th Century Fox was facing significant challenges in the early 1990s, with several very expensive projects failing to connect with audiences, like Enemy Mine and Predator 2. But the concept of Home Alone seemed almost too simple to succeed. An 8-year-old boy gets left behind when his family goes on vacation and has to defend his house from burglars using improvised traps. Critics initially dismissed it as a thin premise that couldn't possibly sustain a full-length feature film. And the slapstick humor, it just seemed so old-fashioned. Director John Hughes was coming off several successful teen comedies, but Home Alone represented a significant departure from his previous work. And the film starred Macaulay Culkin, who was relatively unknown at the time. When the film was released, there were some critics that appreciated its family-friendly humor and Culkin's charismatic performance, but many dismissed it as lightweight entertainment that wouldn't have lasting appeal. But they, seriously, underestimated how much audiences would connect with the film. Home Alone became a massive cultural phenomenon, earning almost $500 million. This made it the highest-grossing comedy of all time at that point. And more importantly for Fox, Home Alone proved that family comedies could be incredibly profitable when done right. Now, what if I told you this next film was literally days away from being canceled, when someone finally said yes, and that one man's comedic improvisation skills accidentally saved an entire movie studio? The concept was relatively simple. Eddie Murphy plays a Detroit police officer who travels to Beverly Hills to investigate a murder, creating culture clash comedy as he encounters the wealthy lifestyle of sunny California. But here's the problem. At the time, Eddie Murphy was still primarily known as a stand-up comedian and Saturday Night Live cast member. Yes, he had a supporting lead role in 48 Hours, but many in Hollywood weren't convinced that he could carry a major action comedy as the lead. The script went through numerous rewrites, and the project was nearly canceled several times during development. And there were even a few Paramount executives that were worried that the film would be too niche to appeal to mainstream audiences, especially since it relied heavily on Murphy's improvisational comedy style. And the script had been rewritten so many times, nobody was sure what the final product would even look like. But when Beverly Hills Cop was released, it became an instant sensation. Murphy's performance as Axel Foley was both funny and charismatic. And audiences loved the fish-out-of-water comedy combined with genuinely well-put-together action sequences. The film made over $234 million in North America alone, making it the highest-grossing film of 1984. It also performed exceptionally well internationally, proving that Murphy's comedy could translate across different cultures. But more importantly for Paramount, the success of Beverly Hills Cop gave Paramount the financial stability they desperately needed. It proved that comedy could be just as profitable as action or drama when executed properly.